First game of Mark Adams as a head coach in the NCAA tournament. We're going to break down the Texas Tech Montana State matchup coming up on today's Locked On Texas Tech.
You are Locked On Texas Tech, your daily podcast on the Texas Tech Red Raiders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Texas Tech, a member of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you have not subscribed to our channel, I highly recommend that you do so now. I'm Ryan Manville. I cover Texas Tech for the Dallas Morning News, and I'm joined by Emery Lida, a longtime Texas Tech analyst, writer, and podcaster. Emery, how you doing, man? It's been a while since we've both been here.
Yeah, man, I've been doing all right, enjoying spring break. It's nice to have you back from New York. I hope you enjoyed that trip. And it's kind of just worked out where we've had kind of our own breaks and our own little things. So I'm excited to be back and covering the NCAA tournament. Obviously, getting started today as we record this Thursday night, we've seen a couple really fun games. We saw, obviously, Richmond upset Iowa, and we've seen, in general, March Madness. And I mean, there's no better time of year to like college basketball and just as a basketball fan, enjoy the chaos that the NCAA tournament can deliver. So I'm really excited to continue watching basketball. And honestly, I'm just feeling grateful to be at this time of year. Finally, the regular season's over. It's time to play basketball. It's time to crown champion.
There's been a lot of good basketball over the last couple of days. As we're recording this, Kentucky is in a nail biter with St. Peter's. I mean, it's that time of year, man. It's March, and I'm very excited to be here, especially to usher in kind of the Mark Adams postseason era. And that's, of course, going to take place against Montana State. So, obviously, a very, very new opponent for Texas Tech and even the fans. Like, I don't know anybody that was like, yeah, man, I've been burning Montana State tape this entire year. Really glad Texas Tech got this matchup because I know a lot about Montana State. Man, I have not watched a lick of Montana State basketball, heard anything about them until obviously Selection Sunday, and then started digging. Their resume, though, is pretty decent. So they went 27-7 this year, won the Big Sky regular season and tournament, 16-4 in conference play, and they get the 14th seed in the West. Emery, I know that you spent a ton of time watching film that I'm sure was painful at times, but what do you draw from this Montana State team as you kind of started to take a look at what they've been up to this year?
Well, I think it's an interesting team, and there's really, if you look at some of the mid-major teams that Tech has faced in the past, they've usually either had a really stingy defense, think like Stephen F. Austin back in 2018. They've had a couple really good players, a la Northern Kentucky in 2019 with Drew McDonald, or they've just been really, really like good at shooting. Think of like an Eastern Washington this year. Like that's when you see the notable mid-majors. And really throughout the tournament, like if you look at the teams that won their conference tournament that made it to the NCAA tournaments that weren't 16 seeds, most of the time you get one of those traits, either really good shooting, really up-paced, fast tempo offense that scores a lot in transition, or someone that just has a really, really good player. And honestly, with no disrespect to Montana State, they don't really have any of that. I think the closest you could say is they're pretty efficient in transition, but they don't really go out and run a ton. So that kind of makes it difficult to really pinpoint that as a particular strength for them. Certainly, they've got a fair amount of good players. I will say one of the things that people are going to overlook, they're going to see that their point guard, Xavier Bishop, who we'll talk about later, is 5'8", and they're going to assume that they don't have size. Size is not going to be an issue for Montana State. That's one of the things that really, if anything, is one of the few strengths I feel like they match up well against Tech is that they're not going to be sort of worried about the size outside of maybe with that one guard matchup, which I would imagine that Tech, if they do what they've done over the course of the year, and I'm not sure if this is the greatest strategy, is going to try to hunt out Bishop and post up situations and mismatches. But beyond that, I mean, this is a Montana State team that really, if you would say that the one thing that they do that is really notable, it's posting up. They are really heavy in the post. If you watch any one of their games, and pretty much regardless of the opponent, regardless of their size, they work they work tirelessly to try to get the ball into the post. And it's not just a real Baylor, who we'll talk about as an individual player who was the Big Sky Player of the Year. It's really even some of their wings. I mean, Amin Adamu is one of the guys that really they work to post up a ton as a 6'5" guard. Obviously, you've got guys like Raekwon Battle that have worked in the post, and then guys like Gray Osabor. Like all of them, you'll see them try to make specific actions in the post. They'll even run kind of a two-man post look, and that is sort of the only team I can think of that ran a lot of post up against Tech in that sort of fashion would be like a Gonzaga, and in terms of just posting up as often as what you see Montana State did. But that's the one thing that I really took away is just how much they work the post. And then they're a good shooting team from a percentage standpoint, but they don't really take a lot of them. And when they do, it's usually in kind of a transition look, or it's off of post up action. They're not one of the teams that really swings the ball around the perimeter, swings it off of drives, which I think is kind of important to distinguish, as that's something that Tech has struggled against this season.
Yeah, I mean, in a vacuum, their offensive numbers look really, really good. I mean, out of 358 Division I basketball teams, here's where Montana State ranks across the board. They're 28th in field goal percentage. They are 37th in three-point percentage. They're 8th in free throws made per game, 15th in free throws attempted per game. They are 41st in points per game. So they've got some decent offensive numbers across the board. But I do agree with you in terms that a lot of the offense that they are generating is very centric on the post. They're getting the ball down low, and they're asking essentially the entire offense to revolve around what's happening down low. And I think you see that in their pace of play. They're a pretty slow basketball team. As you mentioned, not a great ball movement team by any means. Just barely averaging more assists than turnovers per game. But I think why they're so efficient, specifically, what I want to mention is the 3-point percentage and also the free throw frequency. I think why they're so efficient there is the post. And so I think that they draw so much defensive attention to the post that perimeter players get open, and they also force you to foul them down low so much because they're so good. A guy that does that is Bello. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his first name, but Bello, dude shoots like 6 free throws a game. It's nuts. And I think that they have a lot of good free throw shooters on their team, but I think that so much of their offense revolves around getting the ball into the post and then creating outside of that. Do you agree with me? And if you do, how do you think Texas Tech kind of counters that today?
Yeah, I think that you look at Bill and you look at Osabor, and both of them have free throw rates in the 70s and 80s, which is ridiculous for the amount of volume that they've been creating this season. To be able to have a free throw rate that high heading into the tournament, it's incredible. And I do agree. I think that a lot of their action, really, whether it comes from the inside or on the perimeter, comes from the post. They have a fair bit of post playmaking. And in addition to that, they also, I mean, if you look at the 3-point attempts, like I mentioned earlier, it's not really coming off of drives or even open in transition. I will say they're good in transition. That's something that I've noticed is when they get out and run, they can be pretty effective, but they just don't really look to do that all that often. And I think as a way that Tech is going to sort of counter that, it's going to be kind of the same strategy that they've used against guys like Nate Watson this year, guys like David McCormick. You're just going to put a ton of pressure into the post. You're going to make sure on one hand that you make the entry passes as difficult as possible, just kind of swarm the ball handlers, keep the entry passes from even happening. And the second thing is, as soon as they're catching, you're just bringing guys. And that's one of the things I think that you can take advantage of the lack of relative playmaking for guys like Baylor or like Osabor and kind of just utilize that to your advantage, because this is a team that really doesn't rely as much on the pure ball handling and playmaking out of the post, because while they are really a post-centric team, their post players, the guys that get the ball in the post the most, aren't particularly great passers. And so that's one of the things that Tech has really feasted on in years past. I feel like it's one of the things that, if you look at this year, the teams that Tech has had success against are teams that oftentimes try to really work the ball in the post. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't really think that Tech has had a game this year where they've been really just absolutely eaten alive by a straight up post player. Obviously, you can say David McCormick in the Big 12 championship had a really nice game, but I feel like that was really along the lines of Kansas establishing so much else to worry about. Whereas with Montana State, it's kind of the other way around. They use the post to sort of set up the rest of their game.
Yeah, I'm on board with you. And I think that Texas Tech has found a way to eliminate post-centric offenses. This is no knock to Montana State, but against players that are a lot better than the guys that are on this roster. I mean, Texas Tech has implemented really successful defensive game plans against guys like Chet Holmgren, Drew Timme, Nate Watson, just a lot of big ticket names that Texas Tech has really found a way to slow down and eliminate. And so I think that when you're looking at this Texas Tech defense and what they do, I think that you should be really, really favorable of this matchup, because I think that Texas Tech as a team is very mobile. They're going to switch everything, as we know. And I think that their bigs just match up pretty well with Montana State's to begin with. You've been mentioning individual players this entire episode. I want to highlight some of them in depth coming up on our next segment. This is the time of year that I've pretty much given up on all my New Year's resolutions, but not this year. I'm sticking to my resolution to eat right thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not a resolution because I actually enjoy eating Built Bar products. They're not just a protein bar, they're a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. Low calorie, high protein. Replace your candy bars with these, they are better. Go to Built.com and scroll down the macros chart. You're going to be blown away. They're high in protein, low in calorie, high in fiber, and low in carb. Go to Built.com today to get your hands on some of your own. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. Just a reminder that we are free and available on all platforms. Here talking about Montana State and Texas Tech. Noon 45 tip Central on Friday. Let's talk about some of these Montana State players, because although I just kind of did knock on them and saying that they weren't as good as obviously a couple of All-Americans, they've got some really decent players on this team. I think where we've got to start is Xavier Bishop. As you mentioned, Big Sky Player of the Year. Plays almost every single minute of every game, averaging about 14 points per game. Shooting splits are not great. 41.5% from the field, 34% from deep, 77% from the line. But when you're shooting as much as he is, almost 12 shots per game, it's bound to happen. I think that he's a pretty good playmaker. I think that his teammates kind of force his assist numbers to reflect a little bit worse than how good of a point guard he really is. But just a guy that is scrappy, like a guy that really, really knows how to play the point guard position. I think that he has some development and he has some weak spots, but at this point he is who he is. But he's a guy that I think is kind of the archetype of what Texas Tech has struggled against this season. Like quick, scrappy point guards. Now, I don't think that he's at the level of some of the guys they've faced, thinking about like Remy Martin, even like Akinjo, some of these other guys in the Big 12. But I do think that Bishop has a lot of talent, but I do think that what you've got to do is try and force him into difficult shots, because as I mentioned, the efficiency is not really where it needs to be. What have you seen from watching tape on Bishop?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest strength that he has in his game is he's a really creative playmaker. And like you mentioned, I don't think the assist numbers really do it justice for a couple reasons. A, obviously, he has to play in a post-centric offense, which, if you're a guard, is going to limit your assist potential somewhat. And the fact that he's 5'8" and can't really play a part in posting guys up like that. And then the other thing I would say as well is that like they really don't take a lot of catch and shoot opportunities, and they don't use him a ton as in the pick and roll as a guy that really can hit the roller. So most of his assists are going to have to be off of more creative looks and kind of outside of a pure structural flow of the offense. And so for him to be able to still rack up 4 assists a game is pretty impressive. And I mean, I think that speaks volumes to him as a playmaker as well, that he doesn't get himself into trouble a lot. That's one of the things that if you look at guards that are these high usage, kind of inefficient guards to some degree, you see a lot of the time they'll have these high turnover numbers to kind of counter that. And well, I mean, certainly his assisted turnover isn't great. It's about 4.1 to 2.5. You still like that's still a decent number. And especially when you consider, like I mentioned, his assist numbers are kind of deflated. For him to only be having 2.5 turnovers, I feel like is pretty impressive. I think his playmaking is good. In terms of shooting, I think that his 3-point shooting certainly leaves some to be desired. I I mean, he's only 35% for the year, and obviously high degree of difficulty on those shots. That was one thing that I will note is he takes a lot of pull-up shots, and even beyond that, he takes a lot of contested pull-ups. Like, the amount of open threes that he gets is probably significantly lower than most of the guards that you're going to see the Tech faces this year. So for him to kind of be shooting 35%, it's not great per se, but it's also not bad. The big thing that I think he struggles with offensively is he's a predictable driver. He isn't great finishing at the rim, only about 52%. A lot of his drives come to the right. In fact, I feel like sometimes he can be overzealous and trying to force his way right. And so he kind of takes some weird angles. And I also think the height, the lack of leg, he's not someone that really has a ton of leg flexibility in terms of being able to adjust off platform and get these acrobatic looks. And so when he's only 5'8" and he doesn't have that flexibility, it makes his finishing sort of struggle. So I feel like Tech can take advantage of that when it comes to just whenever he's a driver, he's not as much of a threat against solid rim protection as some of the other guards that you're going to see throughout this tournament and the Tech has faced throughout the year. So, I mean, Bishop's a good playmaker, certainly an offensive threat, and I would argue is their best offensive player if you look at things holistically. But the interior finishing and also his lack of elite jump shooting is something that I think is going to hinder him.
Bishop, a very good player, as you mentioned. I think I accidentally misattributed the Big 12 or Big Sky Player of the Year award to him. It was not. It was to his teammate Jabrile Bello, who is one of those guys that Montana State just does anything and everything to get him the ball down low. A 6'9" forward out of London. Actually went to Barking Abbey High School, which is a great high school name, but his numbers this season have taken a bit of a dip from where he was at last year, but he still played good enough to win Conference Player of the Year. 3-time All Big Sky guy. I think he won Big Sky Defensive Player of the Year as well this season. Just a really, really good big man anchoring them down low, averaging 13 points per game, 6.8 boards, 1.8 blocks. I think the one thing with him is what does he do outside of the post? And I'm sure you can add a little bit to that, but I believe he led the Big Sky in true shooting percentage this season, shooting about 59%, which is decent. Not necessarily sky high for a guy that has taken like a handful of threes this season. He's going to operate pretty much exclusively out of the block, but this is the challenge for Texas Tech. It is slowing down this guy in the post, not letting him demand so much defensive attention that his teammates can get open for easy shots.
Yeah, to put things in perspective, Baylor took a total of 188 free throws this year. No two players on Tech's roster, if you combine their total free throw numbers, attempted that many free throws.
That's
So,
nuts. That is
yeah, I
nuts.
mean, he gets to the line so often, and he is such a workhorse in the post that really his like game, at least in the Big Sky, doesn't have to be that diversified outside of. I mean, he's not really a particularly great um, inside presence when it comes from operating off of the roll. Like if I was to sort of equate him, he has a little bit of Namish Keita from last year from Utah State in his game in the sense that a lot of his offense that they operate him into is all out of the post. And when it comes to being good in the pick and roll, I think he's a good finisher off of it, but his screening is not, he's not a good screener. He doesn't really make good plays out of the short roll. And so he's sort of limited in what he can do in that function outside of just purely finishing off of a pass. And I think that's why you see them run a lot of post-up action beyond just the simple fact that they love posting up for some reason. But he's effective at getting the foul line, drawing contact. He's a good finisher. And defensively, he's got good shot blocking instincts. I think that's the three really good things that he does. And he is very good at those. I think he would be, if you were to look at all of the mid-major players that Tech has placed this year, I would say that in those three categories, outside of the Gonzaga bigs, he's probably the best that you faced. But if you look at literally everything else that he does, I think that there's a lot to be desired. He's had knee injuries, if I remember correctly, going back a couple of years, and he's clearly kind of struggled with mobility. His closeouts are not good as a result, and he's not really switchable. I think his sort of processing on the defensive end leaves a little bit to be desired. He can be slow-footed, and as such as well on the offensive end, doesn't really get out in transition all that well. And then as well as that, his playmaking on the offensive end, like he shows flashes, and certainly if you get him on the low block and there's not a lot of defensive pressure, he can be a comfortable passer, but I don't think that's going to be something you're going to see a lot of at Tech. So, I mean, I don't think that the Conference Player of the Year was unjustified. He's certainly a really talented post player, and I think on the defensive side of things, I have a few reservations on that, but certainly he's a great player. But I do think that this is not a matchup where I would say that he matches up particularly well with Tech. I think that this is he's one of the bigs that if you look at the archetype, Tech just tends to do well against guys like that. Even a guy like Derek Culver back at West Virginia. I think if you want to look at just in terms of pure numbers, obviously Baylor is a lot more efficient than what Culver was able to do in terms of finishing, but in terms of their play style, it's not a whole lot different. And Tech always seemed to have a fair bit of success in just mitigating Culver's impact on the offensive end.
We're going to wrap up our thoughts on Montana State, give our keys to the game, as well as our final score prediction coming up in our next segment. It's that time of year again as college basketball's tournament is finally upon us. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, BetOnline.net is the #1 source for all your sports betting needs and info. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season, and it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Previewing Texas Tech, Montana State for today's lunchtime game. It'll actually be like brunch time game for the Red Raiders in San Diego. Very interesting tip-off time, but hey, this is March. Emory, any individual guys you want to highlight here quickly before we move into our keys to the game?
Well, I think for Tech, at least just looking at kind of how they're able to operate, certainly the bigs and Bryson Williams and Kevin O'Banner and Marcus Santos Silva are going to play a big part in sort of being able to stop Baylor. And then as well as that on Montana State side, I want to highlight Great Osabor a little bit because when Baylor was sort of banged up a little bit at the end of the year, Osabor sort of saw his role increase at times, and he's a similar sort of big, just with a little bit more fluidity. And then as well as that, Montana State has guys like Tyler Patterson and Raekwon Battle. If you're looking at the guys that are going to be like the three-point shooters, the spot-up guys, and the role players offensively, those are guys that you can't afford to have get hot, especially Patterson. And he's a 6'8" freshman that really kind of has that off-the-dribble ability. He can hit pull-ups to some degree, and I feel like that's something that it's not alarming for Tech per se, but it's a type of player that I feel like you're going to need to sort of key in on. And Patterson's got talent. I think a couple years down the line, be a really good player for them.
Patterson kind of reminds me of Sean McNeil a little bit. If that dude ever hits the portal, I would not mind him getting a phone call from Mark Adams. Steel Venters, yeah, that's a good shout as well.
2.0, same conference, same everything.
There we go. You and your comps, man. Stat wizard. Looking at the keys to the game, Emory, in my solo episode that I released on Thursday, I said if Texas Tech wanted to make it out of the weekend and move on, they had to defend the perimeter. I think against Montana State, they operate so much out of the post. I'm not worried about Texas Tech matching up down low. I'm just not. They've proven time and time again that they can slow down some of the best bigs in the country. I'm not worried about them getting bruised and abused by Montana State. But what I'm worried about is that offense creating open looks for other guys. And I mentioned that if Texas Tech is going to win this game and then survive against either Notre Dame or Alabama, who are both very good three-point shooting teams, that Texas Tech would need to do the same. Defend the perimeter, don't get open looks. And I think that's one of my keys to the game. I think that really Texas Tech just matches up so well with this team in the post. Texas Tech is the more talented team. I don't think that anybody's debating that. Obviously, you've got a Big Sky team going against a Big 12 team. I think Montana State is like 150th in KenPom. They've got some really strong individual players, but I just don't see matchup-wise how they could win this game. But I do think that they could keep it close if Texas Tech forces too much defensive attention inside and lets guys like you mentioned, the freshman Patterson. Obviously, they've got Abdul Muhammad. They've got some guys that can shoot, Adamu. If you leave them open, they're going to make you pay. And so I think that Texas Tech, they can handle business down low. But what they need to make sure that they don't do is let guys get open for easy looks on the perimeter.
Yeah, and I think that again comes down to you've got to make the initial entry pass as difficult as possible. Just be as disruptive as you can against this Montana State offense because like they're not a team that I feel like is going to be a pace and space style three where they're immediately looking to jack up threes and they really rely on the drive kicks, get past whatever. I think this is going to be much more of a deliberate game. And so if you can kind of wreak havoc on their passing, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to get those open threes in the half court. And I think for me, it comes down to two keys. Number one, don't give them easy opportunities. Don't put yourself in transition defense and sort of needlessly put Montana State in transition because I think in a lot of ways, this Montana State team could be good in transition. They have looked pretty good throughout the season. They're a good three-point shooting team in a vacuum. It's just the way that they get threes, I'm not sure is particularly sustainable or great in terms of a volume standpoint. So just not beating yourself in a sense and letting Montana State get those open looks is going to be one thing. And the second thing is offensively, just continuing to move the ball. I think this is a team that you can really exploit pick and roll matchups with just because their bigs have struggled to defend the perimeter and their mobility is something that really can be an issue. I think if you just purely post up Bryson Williams, Baylor's a good post defender, and he's also an instinctive shot blocker. So you're not going to get as efficient looks out of the post as you might against some other mid majors. It's just running a flowing offense like you did against Kansas, like we saw at times against Iowa State, and pretty much the last couple of weeks we've seen it at points. So just continuing to have that offensive flow, not getting too reliant on the post. Those would be my two keys. I think if you can do that as well as just not beat yourself up and not have them go supernova from three, I think this should be a pretty manageable game.
So what you're saying is run the Bryson Williams defensive game plan against them and don't let them do it to you.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, and I think that's a good strategy. Like it's worked really well against Texas Tech this season, and I think that they can give another team a taste of their own medicine. I think that'd be a really helpful key for Texas Tech to kind of have in their back pocket. I'm not sure what matchups in the West could really be favorable for that, except maybe Gonzaga, but that is far down the line. Texas Tech needs to handle their business with Montana State first, and I think they will pretty easily. I'm going to pick Texas Tech to win this game 72-55. I don't trust this Montana State offense pretty much at all. I think they operate way too much out of the post, and I think that Texas Tech is going to pretty easily shut that down. And I don't think that Montana State has enough talent around the perimeter to make Texas Tech pay, even when there might be a little bit too much defensive attention going inside. I think that Texas Tech survives and advances pretty comfortably here. For my player of the game, I'm going to go Terrence Shannon Jr. I think that in the conference tournament, obviously, he wasn't perfect against Oklahoma, but in those Iowa State and those Kansas games, we saw a Terrence Shannon Jr. that we have not seen really since the first week of the season. It was probably his best week of basketball that he's played since his first 5 or 6 games of the season where he just went on a tear. And he just looks really confident. He looks really healthy, getting the ball to the basket really well, shooting the lights out of the ball right now. Looks really good on his deep shot. I'm going to go him player of the game pretty easily here. I think that he has found something, and it is clicking for him at the right time. TJ, I think, is going to have a big game in this one.
Yeah, he's hit 2 threes in 3 of his last 4 games, and I think that's something that you can really look at or 3 of his last 5 games, I believe, excuse me. I might be a little bit off on that, but he certainly had 2 of his 3 games in the Big 12 tournament. He had at least 2 threes. Obviously, in the Kansas game, that shot was looking absolutely beautiful in the catch and shoot. But in terms of this game, like you mentioned, I feel very confident about this. I just feel like Montana State is so reliant on post offense, and I mean, it works in the big sky. I feel like they have the right personnel to do that. So I'm not going to question their offense. But I think in this game in particular, it's not a good matchup for them because Tech is so good at defending post bigs. And we've seen all season teams that try to force it into the post usually have a lot of turnovers against Tech and they struggle to get shots in the paint. I feel like that's something you're going to see again. Offensively, I'm a little bit more skeptical, but at the same time, this is a Montana State team that really can struggle to close out on shooters, and as well as that can struggle really just in terms of defending ball handlers. And another thing for them is this is going to be by a mile the toughest team that Montana State has faced, while for Tech it's going to be probably the most straightforward matchup from a talent standpoint, the one with where you have the biggest advantage since you've gone out of non-conference play, and that was 3 months ago. So I feel like this is a game the Tech needs. I think they're going to get a pretty easy win. I'm going to go with a final score of 77-55. A little bit on the big margin side, but I certainly think the Tech's defense, I have faith in them holding Montana State over under 60. As well as I just feel like in the half court, Tech's going to have a lot of success. And since you took who was going to be my player of the game and Terrence Shannon, I'll go ahead and say this is going to be a nice game for Adonis Arms. I feel like his playmaking has taken a huge leap throughout the season. And if you see a lot of pick and roll action, which I feel like you might against this Montana State team, then his playmaking out of the pick and roll, it's been something that I've really liked over the last month or so. And I feel like it's going to be a pretty big key in this one.
I think Texas Tech would take a big game from a playmaker pretty much any night, but especially in this one to just kind of help the offense gain a little bit of control. But thank you all for tuning in and hearing our thoughts on Montana State. We hope that you enjoy the game. For all of you who are on the West Coast, I hope that your coffee is hot and strong. It's obviously some pretty early basketball, especially if you're jet lagged, but I'm sure the Red Raiders will keep it pretty interesting. At least, I mean, if you're a Texas Tech fan, if you're a Montana State fan, you should probably just go ahead and head back to Montana right about now. But until that game, you can follow me on Twitter at RMainvilleLBK. You can follow Emery at eraser41. I'm sure we both will be live tweeting during the game tomorrow. You can follow the official Locked On Texas Tech Twitter page at Locked On TTU so you never miss an episode when it goes live. Thanks for making Locked On Texas Tech your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for joining us.